We're going to go to the National Press Club in Canberra, where the Immigration Minister, Bowen, is about to start an address. He'll be talking today about the future of the government's skilled migration program. It's also likely he'll face questions about the High Court challenge announced this week by lawyer David Mann against the practice of detaining refugees indefinitely if ASIO gives them an adverse security assessment. We'll go to the National Press Club right now.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Lyndall. When Australia created the world's first dedicated Department of Immigration in 1945, the goal was relatively simple: populate or perish. There wasn't a sophisticated approach to choosing which skills Australia needed. There was a drive to increase our population, as this was seen as being key to our economic future. 65 years later, our economic growth and ongoing prosperity is still very much tied up with immigration. Our economy has grown and developed. Our focus has turned to skilled migration to fill what are some quite specific economic needs. Australia's economic success over recent years means that our employment rate is comparatively high by international standards, and of course unemployment is comparatively low. But any objective look at the Australian economy will tell you that there are areas of real skill and labour shortage, both in geographic areas and industry sectors. Australians expect that every effort should be made to ensure that Australians fill those jobs, and they're right. That's why this government is investing in $15.6 billion in skills and training initiatives, including through the Building Australia's Future Workforce strategy announced in last year's budget. We've created 130,000 new training places, and an additional 150,000 students are now attending university. We've lifted participation in higher education and higher vocational education and training in particular, and there are now more Australians doing a trade apprenticeship than ever before. We've also doubled the investment in school education and upgraded facilities at every school. But just as true and critical is this point: a properly executed skilled migration program is important for creating jobs. In Australia's patchwork economy, certain sectors and certain areas of the country face, and inevitably will continue to face, skill shortages. And if these jobs continue to go unfilled, work goes undone, putting a handbrake on economic growth. Take the resources sector, for example. There's been plenty of loose talk in recent years about the impact of the minerals resource rent tax and the carbon price on mining investment. But in fact, companies tell me their biggest challenge when financing their major expansion works is convincing financiers that they'll be able to source enough skilled labour to finish the project on time and on budget. A government that cares about creating economic growth and job creation will ensure that skilled migration is calibrated to fill those gaps that simply can't be filled locally. A well-managed and strategic migration program creates jobs. It doesn't take them away. Businesses are expected to invest a record $120 billion in Australia's resources sector over the next 12 months. And there's more of this to come, with a total pipeline of resources investment worth $500 billion, with spillover effects in construction, manufacturing and the services sector. Indeed, Treasury estimates that business investment as a proportion of GDP will reach its highest level since records were kept. In order to facilitate this growth, we need skilled migration. But there are other important arguments for skilled migration, not least the need to deal with our long-term intergenerational challenges. This year marks a decade since the release of the first intergenerational report by Treasury. Each report has told a different story, but one very important theme has remained throughout. Australia's population is ageing, and this represents a significant but not insurmountable fiscal and economic challenge over the long term. There will be fewer workers to support our retirees and children, which will put a drag on economic growth and pressure on budgets. Without migration, Australia's labour force is predicted to stall by 2036, and then it will start shrinking. Migration, particularly skilled migration, can ameliorate this challenge because it delivers on each of the famous 3 Ps: population, productivity and participation. Migrants tend to be younger than the Australian population. The median age of migrants to Australia is 31 years, compared to our overall median age of 37 years. As a result, our skilled migration programs deliver prime working age migrants that will contribute to Australia's society and economy for years. This helps offset ageing and keeps our labour force growing. Recent primary skilled migrants have a participation rate of 96%, much higher than the Australian average of 65%. Skilled migrants also have a high level of educational attainment. Since 2000, 3/4 of the migrants arriving in Australia have had a post-school qualification, compared to half of the Australian-born population. Recently arrived migrants are similarly much more likely to have a university education. In the past few years, there have been significant reforms to our skilled migration program. Unlike 65 years ago, the key is not now simply attracting large numbers. As an obviously attractive place to live and work, we get many more applications than available positions each year. Today, the key is ensuring the proper calibration so that businesses that can genuinely not find domestic workers can fill those positions without making migration a cheaper or easier option than hiring and training Australians. It's about making sure our migrants have the best possible skills and the skills our economy needs. In 2008, we began reforming our temporary skilled worker, or 457 program, to make it more responsive to business cycles, while also protecting Australian jobs and conditions. We introduced the Worker Protection Act to protect vulnerable workers and market wage requirements to ensure that 457 visa holders are paid equivalent wages and conditions as their Australian co-workers. Further reforms to the 457 program were introduced last year to reward employers who play by the rules by giving them streamlined processing arrangements. In 2010, we implemented a more targeted skilled occupation list for independent skilled migration. The new list is informed by Skills Australia with regard to Australia's genuine need for high-value occupations over the medium to longer term. In 2011, we introduced a new points test for independent skilled migration with a stronger focus on English language proficiency, on-the-job work experience and higher levels of education, all of which are factors which contribute towards success in the labour market. And in another significant reform, from the 1st of July this year, we will introduce Skills Select, which will speed up visa processing and help to select the best and brightest migrants, rather than just those who meet a minimum requirement. Now, the opposition would have you believe that our skilled migration programs are a blunt instrument. They say the permanent migration program is not catering for the skill needs in Western Australia, for example. That's just wrong. The case for Western Australia speaks for itself. In 2010-11, that state comprised just over 10% of Australia's domestic population, yet attracted over 15% of permanent skilled migrants. In addition, with 88% growth in 457 visa applications, Western Australia has overtaken Victoria as the second largest user of the 457 visa program. And if current application rates continue, Western Australia is set to become the biggest user of the program in 2012-13. And with civil engineers, mechanical engineering technicians and geologists featuring in the top 3 occupations, it's clear migrants are going where they're needed and in the occupations they're needed. Temporary skilled migrants help plug skills gaps for Australia's growth industries like mining and construction and health services. For example, mining and construction comprise over 1/5 of the 457 visa program. They address skills needs in our growth regions like Western Australia and Queensland. For instance, more than 40% of our temporary skilled migrants are going to jobs in Western Australia and Queensland. In light of the current mining boom, the significant investment in the resources sector and growing pressure for skills, 457 visas provide an important safety valve for the Australian labour market. While the community justifiably wants to ensure that Australians get the first go at job opportunities this boom represents, skilled migrants are critical to getting these projects off the ground. A good example is Hoffman Engineering, a successful manufacturing business in Western Australia that employs 600 Australians and exports to around 20 countries. Through the 457 program, Hoffman has recently been able to hire a number of highly experienced, highly specialised workers. This means that Hoffman will be able to bid for more work than they otherwise could have, so that they can keep their business growing. It also means that Hoffman will be able to take on more young apprentices. In fact, they anticipate putting on 25 new apprentices by the end of the year. This is a worthy achievement for a business where already around 10% of its workforce is made up of apprentices. The 457 program is flexible and adaptable. It's demand-driven, so that it's highly responsive to our diverse and dynamic labour market over the economic cycle. In other words, 457 visas are issued when the need arises and fewer issued when business conditions slow. This elasticity ensures that we do not have an oversupply of temporary skilled migrants if the economy slows. Moreover, there's no limit on the number of 457 visas that can be issued. The program is uncapped. So if business conditions are such that more migrants meet the criteria, more 457 visas will be issued. That's why I'm always bemused when I hear some business leaders, who really ought to know better, call for the government to increase the number of 457 visas. It's an uncapped program. Before the Labor government reformed the program, much of the public commentary focused on instances of exploitation. But now the 457 program has never been stronger, and the vast majority of 457 sponsors do the right thing. Increased applications, faster processing times and stronger integrity measures enshrined in law have redefined how the community and business view the program. Now, the opposition leader claims the government has made the 457 program harder to use, but he's wrong. We've made it fairer, not harder, and the facts speak for themselves. In the year to the 31st of March, there have been 36% more 457 visa lodgements than in the same period last year. And in fact, at the end of March, the number of 457 visa holders in Australia reached an all-time high of 88,590 people. Even with this large number of 457 applications, processing times are at historically low levels. The current median processing time for a 457 application is 17 calendar days. We've halved the average processing time since 2007, before these reforms were introduced. What we've done is improve protections against exploitation of 457 workers. If Mr Abbott intends to reverse these protections, he should say so. As part of the 2011-12 budget, Labor established a new 457 processing centre in Brisbane with the aim of reducing the median processing time to 10 days for complete applications. This is working, and the majority of applications lodged in March, for example, were decided in 10 days. The 457 program also promotes investment in the training of Australians. The program's training requirements compel sponsors to provide evidence of recent training to sponsor overseas workers. This creates a positive joint commitment to sponsor overseas workers. It creates a commitment between business and government to increase the skills of the Australian workforce, reducing reliance on overseas workers over time. Take the new scholarship program, Indigenous Leadership in the Resources Sector, by the Chamber of Minerals and Energy in Western Australia. This program, entirely funded from the 457 program training benchmarks, will provide scholarships to Indigenous people to undertake a nationally accredited study through the Australian Institute of Management. While the program is off to a modest start, with 4 scholarships now having been awarded, it is expected to continue and grow over time. This brings me to enterprise migration agreements. In 2010, the National Resources Sector Employment Task Force, chaired by the then Parliamentary Secretary for Northern and Western Australia, Gary Gray, projected that there could be at least 30,000 construction jobs on new resource projects in every year to 2015. It stated that the number of jobs in mining and gas operations could grow by up to 65,000. The task force recommended a more responsive and flexible 457 program with improved processing times. We've done that. The task force also recommended introducing enterprise migration agreements, or EMAs, for mega resources projects to allow these projects to negotiate up front for the temporary migration needs of the project before the project commences. EMAs will manage the risks that I referred to earlier, the risk that mining companies will not be able to get enough skilled workers to complete new projects on time and to budget. At the same time, EMAs will create jobs and training opportunities for Australians, because without them, there's a real risk that some large projects simply will not proceed. So today, I'm pleased to announce the first enterprise migration agreement has been reached with the Roy Hill project, and we'll be signing the necessary documents shortly. There's no doubt that Roy Hill is a project of national significance. This $9.5 billion iron ore project, located in the Pilbara, is expected to produce 55 million tonnes of iron ore each year for the next 20 years, starting in 2014. The project will create significant benefits to the Australian economy through its capital investments, export earnings and employment and training opportunities for Australians for decades. Over 6,700 Australians are expected to be employed during the construction phase of the project. This represents at least 80% of the workforce. The EMA will allow Roy Hill to sponsor up to 1,715 workers for the 3-year construction phase of the 457 visa program, where they cannot find Australians to fill the positions. It will cover occupations like electricians, mechanical fitters, scaffolders and boilermakers. The EMA sets out protections to ensure that visa holders engaged on the project receive the same wages and workplace conditions as their Australian counterparts, and that those workers are protected under Labor's Workplace Protection Act. The government will ensure that visa holders are aware of their workplace rights and obligations through a specific induction program. The government will soon release a multilingual video that will be shown to overseas workers as part of their induction program on the project. Other materials will also be provided to visa holders, including contact details for the Department of Immigration and Citizenship, Fair Work Australia and relevant unions. Of course, the government is committed to ensuring jobs arising from the project are filled locally. To this end, the government will establish a jobs board and expects that foreign workers are only recruited after genuine efforts to employ Australians. The jobs board will also be useful in assessing the case for future potential EMAs. Indeed, the agreement has specific clauses that will require both Roy Hill and its contractors to continue to prioritise the recruitment of Australians throughout the life of the project. And I understand that Roy Hill is launching a major national recruiting drive starting in the coming weeks. As part of the agreement, Roy Hill will provide up to 2,000 training places for Australians. This includes places for more than 200 Australian apprentices and trainees, as well as preparing over 100 Indigenous Australians to work in the construction industry. 2/3 of the apprenticeships that Roy Hill will offer will go to mature Australians. That is, a tram driver from Melbourne or a bricklayer from Hobart or a taxi driver from Tamworth will have the opportunity to participate in apprenticeships which will provide them with a trade qualification they can use for the rest of their lives. In total, Roy Hill is set to invest in excess of $20 million in the training of Australians in a variety of programs, including traineeships, apprenticeships, upskilling and leadership training. We'll conduct regular reviews to ensure lawful and appropriate settings of these arrangements are maintained, including training and occupational health and safety obligations are upheld. This agreement will ensure that regional and national skills shortages do not constrain this significant project and jeopardise economic growth and local jobs. It will also help ease the pressure on local industries that can't compete for labour with major resources projects and are therefore placed in jeopardy. Now, of course, the government understands that Australians are looking to take up the opportunities this mining boom offers and that there are people doing it tough as a result of the patchwork economy, particularly in the manufacturing sector. That's why we're establishing the Jobs Board and a link to the EMA program. Our migration program is important to our economy, not only in the area of skills, but also in innovation and capital investment. Around the world, many countries use a small portion of their migration program to encourage investment. I believe Australia can do better. So today, I can announce the introduction of a new significant investment visa, together with a suite of reforms to our business skills program, now to be known as the Business Innovation and Investment Program, to commence on the 1st of July this year. Australia is well placed to attract investors who are looking for the financial security offered by a stable government and economy. Of course, this new permanent visa will be available to people from other countries on a non-discriminatory basis, but I expect considerable interest across Asia and from China in particular. The China Private Wealth Report of 2011 cites that private wealth market of China is ever increasing and that approximately 47% of ultra high net worth individuals who have investable assets of at least $15 million are considering an application for investment migration. Australia has an opportunity to tap into this potential market. The new significant investor visa will be available for people who invest at least $5 million in Australia in either state and territory bonds, Australian Security Investment Commission regulated managed funds, or direct investments in Australian companies. While we're talking about a comparatively small number of people, their investments will offer a disproportionate boost to the Australian economy and the financial services sector, particularly through infrastructure and managed funds. Diversifying the business skills program to attract high-end investors allows Australia to remain internationally competitive in ensuring economically valuable migrants. Attracting migrants of this calibre will increase competition and commercial activity, generate employment in Australia and further develop links with international markets. It's been almost a decade since our business skills program was last reviewed. In 2011, I asked the department to review this program to ensure it was meeting its objectives. Reforms stemming from this review will focus on innovation amongst our migrant entrepreneurs. Until now, the program has frankly advantaged businesses like takeaways and small retail outlets, which are fairly conservative, without an innovation focus. We want to select business migrants with a good track record of entrepreneurship and encourage them to take a more innovative, bolder business decision with greater certainty around their resident status while they're doing so. We will offer budding entrepreneurs a chance at venture capital funding for commercialising new ideas. We will select entrepreneurs who are innovative, migrants who can bring new ideas and ways of doing business in Australia. We'll introduce a points test and give them recognition for their proven track record of innovation. We'll also give them greater confidence to take risks in business. Our economy is the envy of advanced economies throughout the world. Skilled migrants make an immediate contribution to Australia by bringing their experience, skills and education with them. Their attributes build participation and productivity, and they help to balance what is an otherwise ageing population. This government has introduced a number of ambitious and wide-reaching reforms over recent years. These reforms have consistently struck the right balance, strengthening the contribution of skilled migrants to Australia's ongoing prosperity, while ensuring that our first priority of jobs for Australians is not compromised. As circumstances change, so do the government's migration policies, reflecting the dynamic nature of the Australian economy. This can be seen in the development and now introduction of enterprise migration agreements in the reforms to the business skill migration program. The government will continue to shape our skilled migration policies to attract migrants who build our productivity and prosperity in the interests of all Australians. Thank you for your time today.
And now it's time for questions from our media members, and because I've got the microphone and the list, that makes me first. Minister, you talked about the new visa program for cashed-up investors. How do you make sure they stay here in the long term, they don't effectively become fly-in, fly-out investors if business conditions turn down here or are better in another country?
Well, there's a process, Lyndall, for people to become a provisional visa holder, and that will be subject to the investment continuing in Australia. They'll need to keep that investment for at least 4 years, and it will need to be a substantial investment. There's also a residence requirement that goes with that. So I think what we're looking for is an investment in Australia financially, also an investment emotionally into the future of Australia, because these are people who can contribute a lot to investing in our capital and providing for investment in very important projects throughout the country. So I think there'll be strong interest in this. Australia is a very attractive place to have residence rights in, as I think most of us would agree, the best country in the world. And I think that's something that will find a lot of interest throughout Asia and the rest of the world.
And the next question is from Andrew Tillett from the West Australian.
Yes, thank you, Minister. While you've been doing your speech here, some of the unions over in Perth have been doing a press conference as well about the announcement around Roy Hill. I wonder what you say to those concerns that about you introducing a program to bring in migrants when they say Australian workers can't get a job right now on these sorts of projects.
Well, being Immigration Minister is an introduction to having very many views expressed about very many areas, and sometimes being criticised from the left and the right about exactly the same thing. And skilled migration is no different. Unions play a very important role in Australia, and they play a very important role in reflecting the views of their membership. But governments make decisions, and governments make decisions based on the evidence before them. And when you look at this project, for example, all the evidence presented to us is that it would be much harder for this project to proceed without this sort of certainty. This is about providing certainty for the investors. People can make 457 applications all the time, but if you have upfront agreement and certainty, that makes the investment much more likely to proceed, and therefore around 7,000 jobs for Australians created. Now, in relation to this project, it's in the Pilbara. The Pilbara is a great place, but it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody, and many people with families and links to capital cities around Australia would think hard about moving to the Pilbara, and that's why attracting temporary migrants to Australia to work in places like the Pilbara is an important part of the suite of the measures we have.
The next question is from Sophie Morris from the Australian Financial Review.
Sophie Morris. Minister, you said it's important that skilled migration and 457 visas are not simply a means of getting cheaper, easier labour for employers. Have you done calculations about how much extra it will cost per employee under this EMA? You mentioned that there'll be $20 million spent on training initiatives, but are there also extra costs associated with providing the support for each employee that will make it more expensive for the company to hire migrant workers than Australian workers?
In effect, yes, Sophie, there are. There's a requirement, of course, for the employers to pay market rates, and also a requirement for the employer to pay the cost of travel to Australia and from Australia when the employment is finished. That's not an insubstantial cost. And of course we have requirements that, as you say, go to training of other workforces. Now, some of that training would occur anyway, but there's specific requirements on the proponents to train Australians, and also requirements to ensure proper induction of those who come. I think, obviously, we want to make sure that employers employ Australians as the first option, but we want them to have the ability to get access to those overseas employees when they need to, and that's exactly what this agreement does.
It could be, though, that paying the travel costs for Australian workers to move from one side of the country could be reasonably the same as paying overseas travel costs, though,
well, sure, but obviously the further you have to bring somebody, the more it costs. So yes, employers would often offer to pay the travel costs of people to move to this part of Australia, but there's actually an obligation on them under the agreement to pay the travel costs of overseas workers under this agreement.
The next question from Dan Flitton.
Yes, Minister, you mentioned you do have a very broad portfolio. I want to drag you away a little bit from the subject of your speech today.
There's a surprise, Daniel.
And talk to you a bit about refugees that have adverse ASIO clearances and are presently in a sort of a form of indefinite detention. Now, in the last 6 months, we've seen in December the National Conference of the Labor Party make a recommendation for a national security monitor to review this. We've had a parliamentary report in March which made a number of recommendations as alternatives to indefinite detention. We've had a response from the government to say that this is a complex issue that you're working through. But at the end of the day, can we have any confidence that there will be changes to the process of indefinite detention, which is a decision that you as the Minister have to make? Or are you yet to be convinced of the merits of the need for a change?
Well, thanks for the question, Daniel. It is a serious issue and it is a complex one. We can't have the situation where people who come to Australia by a different method could think that, well, if I come with a valid visa, I might be denied a security clearance and entry to Australia, but if I come through boat, then I can get around that. That can't be the situation. We cannot have the situation where people who are regarded by ASIO as a national security risk are not dealt with very seriously. Having said that, we are talking about people's liberty and people's liberty over the long term. That's why some time ago I said there was a case for examining a review of ASIO decisions. The Attorney-General is working through the detail of that and how that would work, and she'll of course have more to say when she's in a position to. In relation to this issue, she and I obviously talk regularly and have discussed those various recommendations, and she'll be in a position to say more when she's completed that work.
Is there a fundamental point, though, that to accord people due process, decisions should be reviewable and transparently so, be seen to be reviewable?
Well, of course, there are complexities in dealing with information which goes to Australia's national security, both in terms of ASIO's operation and the information that it procures as part of those investigations, and there's some of the things which need to be weighed up.
The next question is from Lauren Wilson from The Australian.
Lauren Wilson from The Australian, Minister. On the new investor class of visa that you've announced today, does the government intend to promote this new visa in countries such as China? And will there be any additional concessions for investors who are looking to move to places outside of Sydney and Melbourne, say the regions or mining areas?
Well, Lauren, as a former financial services minister, I have a funny idea that we won't need to promote it. The financial services industry will be out there promoting it, including managed funds and Australia's very well developed financial services providers who are already looking for opportunities in Asia, and I think they'll be taking this opportunity and making sure that their potential clients throughout the world are fully apprised of the benefits. In answer to the second part of your question, no, there's no plans or no part of the program makes a difference between where people would propose to reside. We are talking about, as I said in my speech, small numbers in terms of the number of people involved, but large impact in terms of the money invested.
The next question is from Peter Phillips from the Press Club.
Minister, Peter Phillips, one of the directors of the National Press Club. China's very much in focus, of course, and one notes the recent discussions by your colleague, the Foreign Minister, Senator Carr, with his Chinese hosts on matters relating to investment in Australia by SOEs, but it also brought into focus what is the looming next phase of China's engagement of Australia and the Australian opportunity, minerals and energy resources ongoing, but agriculture and agricultural resources and China's long-term food security. This brings us to the question of Chinese involvement, Chinese presence, Chinese activity in food production in Australia. Intense interest in dairying, intense interest in feedlotting as the Chinese look towards diversification of source of protein for the Chinese diet. This is going to bring a lot of pressure, I suspect, on your department in relation to visas for Chinese workers, potentially Chinese workers in the future in areas like dairying, in feedlotting and things like that. Can you give us any ideas about preparations which are in train? The EMAs and the 457s fix the Pilbara broadly with minerals and energy resources, but agriculture and agricultural resources and food security, what are the preparations in train for Chinese agricultural workers here or Chinese feedlot production workers here?
Well, of course, matters of investment in agriculture are handled by the Treasurer and the Minister for Agriculture. In relation to visa settings and preparations for applications, this year marked the first year in Australian history that more migrants came to Australia from a country other than the United Kingdom, and that country was China. That was the last program year. This year so far, more migrants have come to Australia from India than any other country, although by the end of the program year, China or the UK may have returned to the top position. We'll see how the numbers turn out at the end. My message out of that figure is that Australia's immigration program is responsive to emerging needs, and our resourcing is responsive to emerging needs. And when needs emerge, whether it's in the resources sector or changes in student numbers, we respond accordingly, whether that be in emerging markets, and the numbers of the markets in our top 10 source countries do change from time to time, and we respond to that in terms of the resources we put in place and the measures we put in place for any visa type. So I think we run a pretty responsive and flexible system which does respond to the emerging economic trends we see across the country at any given time.
And sectoral political responses?
Well, as I say, investment in agriculture is really a matter for the Treasurer and the Agriculture Minister, which they would deal with. Our job is to facilitate government policies as expressed in other areas and facilitate and ensure fast but appropriate levels of checks and processing for any applications we get.
Next question is from Ken Randall.
Minister Ken Randall from Media Monitors. It seems to me that your message that immigration creates jobs rather than displaces Australian workers has been meeting increasing opposition from some of the commentariat, from probably the more conservative parts of the commentariat recently, and so has the whole idea of a bigger population Does that concern you, and how will it affect your thinking about future policies like the ones you've talked about today?
Well, immigration, Ken, is always controversial. You always have people who say it's too high or too low. Our job is to set the policy based on all the evidence in front of us. But it is also to engage in the conversation with the Australian people about the benefits of migration, properly managed migration. And it is also incumbent on governments, I think, to ensure public support for migration. And some of the public commentary around migration is particularly unfortunate, including from politicians. Some of the demonising of particular types of migrants is particularly unfortunate and therefore into a broader community concern. But one of the things as Immigration Minister I see my role as doing is doing what I've just done, talking about some of the strengths of immigration, why it's important, and the counterfactual. What would happen if we didn't have strong immigration policies? Our labour market would cease to grow by 2036, which is not that far away in strategic terms. Having one of the world's strongest economies with our labour market ceasing to grow is not something any responsible government could contemplate.
Next question from Andrew Tillett again.
Thank you again. Just back to asylum seekers. We've had a situation where obviously the High Court last year ruled the Malaysia solution was illegal. The government's response to that was to try and get it through Parliament, obviously, and hopefully, from your point of view, try and shame Tony Abbott into supporting it, I guess, with every time a boat comes blaming him for blocking the legislation. But obviously he's not going to bend on that. I wonder if you've got a plan C up your sleeve, especially given that in the past month we've had 12 boats with 1,000 people on it, which in terms of the humanitarian visa intake is you'd basically fill it just from asylum seekers coming by boat alone if that sort of rate was continued.
Well, Andrew, you're right. We have seen a big increase in boat arrivals in the last month or so. I predicted this last October when I said, as a result of the High Court decision and then the announcement of the Liberal Party that they would oppose the legislation, that we would see more people arriving by boat. We have had a similar situation before and similar numbers before. And at that point, a Prime Minister went to an opposition leader and said, I need your help to pass this legislation. And that opposition leader said yes. John Howard went to Kim Beazley and said, I need your numbers to pass this legislation through the Senate. Kim Beazley said, I don't agree with all your policy, but you're the Prime Minister, you should have the ability to implement it. Kim Beazley was a much more constructive leader of the opposition than the current incumbent. But what we will see, what you are right, the opposition has shown an intransigent approach to this. It's quite clear that as the government works to implement offshore processing, will do so with no assistance from the opposition, unlike John Howard.
Is it time, though, to put your legislation or the legislation developed by Rob Oakeshott to a vote?
Well, that legislation will come to a vote at the time of the Parliament and the selection committee's choosing. It will come to a vote and there'll be an opportunity. I notice the Liberal Party keeps saying we'll bring the legislation on. They seem to be very keen to vote against it.
I'd like to ask you one question, given the bruising week there's been in federal politics. Tony Abbott, the Leader of the Opposition, has said this morning it would be in the best interests of Craig Thomson and his family if he left Parliament. I'd like to get your views on that, but also your view that with the finding of the allegations and findings by Fair Work Australia against Mr Thomson and the debate surrounding that, what that does for the standing of politicians generally and for the government.
In relation to the first part of your question and Mr Abbott's comments today, I must say I found them pretty insincere. He called for Mr Thomson's resignation from the Parliament because he said it was in his best interest. I think he had his own political best interest more front of mind there, and given the nature of the attack we've seen over recent weeks and months, expressing sympathy for Mr Thomson's personal position seems pretty insincere to me this morning. In relation to the findings, look, I think there's a very important principle here. We're 150 members of a parliament. We're not 150 members of a jury. And there is an important principle in terms of due process. Yes, of course, controversies like this, which do happen every so often in terms of allegations against members of parliament, do affect the way people see members of parliament generally. Of course they do. But I think most people recognise that regardless of any allegation against any member of parliament at any particular time from whatever political party, the vast majority of members of parliament on both sides or all sides are good people with Australia's best interests at heart, going about trying to do their best for the country.
There's a lot of talk about your government needing to get clear air, which seems a little mythical at this point in time. Can you see a time ahead where you will get clear air, space free of controversies to sell what you stand for? Or is that just the political climate we're in?
Oh, well, look, we're in a very robust and some would say toxic political environment with allegations being thrown around. And yes, that is a pretty big part of the Australian political discourse, and it does make engaging in policy debates harder. And engaging in our argument for the future of Australia harder. Of course it does, but you've just got to stay the course. And as to your question about whether there'll be clear air, well, you know when there's clear air when you've got it, and you know that there's clear air when you're having a policy discussion, which people are paying attention to, and that's what we'll continue to engage in.
And Sophie Morris.
Firstly, just following from Lyndall's question, are you getting feedback from your constituents about people being frustrated about the disgust at what we're seeing in Parliament repeatedly now? Are you getting that sort of feedback? You said people are convinced that everyone is there with a good will, but outside in the electorate there must be some frustration there. So I wanted your views on that. But also on the Enterprise Migration Agreement, do you expect this will be the first of many such agreements? And if so, are there any that are now in train? Any you expect to be announcing soon? And how many visas do you expect might eventually be issued to the resources industry under such agreements?
In relation to your first question, yes. I do get feedback that there are big issues for Australia, big issues for families, big issues when it comes to cost of living and employment and the economy and the environment that people want Australia's politicians to be dealing with. And I do get feedback that there's too much focus on issues of point scoring and not enough on issues of substance. And so that's a constant reminder of what we're here for. In relation to your second inquiry, yes, there are more EMAs under discussion, a small number. The total number will depend, of course, on final investment decisions, and those other discussions are at an early stage, and there'll be lots more discussion to go. For example, in relation to this EMA, we didn't agree, obviously, to everything Roy Hill asked for. There was a discussion about what the government was prepared to agree to, and we required things to be changed and for extra protections to be built in. Those discussions can take some time. Anywhere, there's estimates of somewhere between 10 and 30 projects which might meet EMA standards over the medium term, but there's a lot of final investment decisions to be made and a lot more discussion, and this is a long process. We've been talking to Roy Hill about this EMA and working on it for a long time, and I expect the other potential agreements to be similar in terms of the time frame.
Next question, Dan Flitton from The Age.
Minister, I'm going to be a dog with a bone on this one. Just back on the ASIO issue. The Director-General of ASIO, David Irvine, last night told a parliamentary hearing that neither yourself or Attorney-General Roxon had sought any review of these ASIO adverse assessments, despite some of these people being held now in detention for 3 years. Why is it that you haven't sought any review?
Well, as I say, the matter of a review is a structural one. Should there be a review of ASIO assessments, that's something we're seriously examining. You don't have an ad hoc review and ring up ASIO and say, well, I think you should have a review of this case or that case. You put in place an appropriate structure for those reviews, and in terms of whether it should be done externally and by whom and in what format. That's the structural issue which the government is examining at the moment, not individual cases. These are difficult cases, very difficult cases for everybody involved. Nobody enjoys dealing with these cases. There are important matters at stake for the individuals and for the nation, and it's important that we get the framework right.
Lauren Wilson.
Minister, we've seen research published recently, I think over the last week, which would indicate that the tide of public opinion is turning against migration. Do you believe that there's a link to a sense that our borders are more porous because we are seeing the record numbers of boat arrivals?
Look, I think there's a number of factors which go into public support for immigration, economic factors, confidence, etc. I do think that it's important in relation to public support for the overall migration program, that there's public confidence in border protection. I do think that, and I've said that publicly. That was one of the reasons, for example, I argued successfully before Labor's National Conference that we should adopt a clear policy of offshore processing, which was a significant step for a Labor Party conference to take. And one of the reasons I argued that is because we do need to build public support for migration more generally. The other point I'd make is that when you have politicians saying that these people are unsafe in our community, that they shouldn't be accommodated in Australian houses, that there's health risks and there are law and order risks, I think that is very irresponsible and does go to that public support for immigration more generally.
And Ken Randall.
Minister, I suppose in a way this follows on from that last question, but multicultural policy is part of your portfolio, and it's tended to fade a bit from public prominence in recent times, but there still seems to be a very sharp divide between the people who believe it is successful and those who think it's a complete failure. Where would you put it in the scale of things?
I think Australia's multiculturalism has been a success. I grew up in Australia's most multicultural area. And last year I recommitted formally the government to the principle of multiculturalism. And the point I made is that multiculturalism is under attack around the world, but Australia has a pretty unique model of multiculturalism and a pretty unique experience. We have a formal policy of multiculturalism based around citizenship, the highest take-up of citizenship from migrants together with Canada in the world, based on a model of mutual respect and based on a model of the dominance of traditional Australian values to the degree of any conflict. And I made those remarks in a speech last year, and remarks which I think have received considerable attention from those interested in the field of multiculturalism, and which pretty clearly put on the record this government's view that multiculturalism is a good thing, something to be nurtured, and the benefits of it to be discussed broadly.
Morris Riley.
Minister, a soft question, if I may. What do you like most about being Immigration Minister, and what do you really dislike about being the Minister? And then I'll have a second question after you answer that.
How long have we got, Morris? There's a couple of things about being Minister for Immigration. Firstly, it's one of the few areas where you get to range across, one of the few portfolios where you get to range across the three key areas of government responsibility. Economic policy, I've been talking about today. National security, we've been talking a little bit about today. And it gives me the opportunity to be a member of the National Security Committee of the Cabinet, which is a wonderful opportunity and a great obligation. And then thirdly, social policy, dealing with issues like multiculturalism, settlement, and the issues of it being a vibrant, cosmopolitan, multicultural society. So you don't get bored being Immigration Minister, and you certainly, while there's a lot of public speculation and public commentary on one part of being Immigration Minister, there's actually a much broader responsibility, which is a great honour. Secondly, the good thing about being Immigration Minister is there's a great opportunity to do good for individuals in difficult circumstances. Again, part of the portfolio which doesn't get much attention. The Minister for Immigration has more personal intervention power than any other minister in terms of individual outcomes. It's a big obligation. There are about 5,000 personal cases that only the minister can consider every year, and you take that obligation very seriously and read through people's circumstances, and you can say, well, the law may not actually deal with this circumstance based on pretty compelling, compassionate grounds, and you can intervene and help a family or help an individual. You do have to take that responsibility carefully, and you can't let it be a safety valve which can be abused, but it's an important safety valve. And again, that's part of being Immigration Minister that not many people would think about. And I know many of my predecessors have really struggled with that workload of those individual cases and the strains it puts on your decision making of trying to do the right thing by each individual person. In relation to the challenges of being Immigration Minister, when you become Immigration Minister, you realise after about a week that anything you say is likely to annoy 80% of the Australian population. Some because it's too hard, some because it's too soft, but whatever it is, everybody will have a view. Once you come to terms with that fact, it's a very enjoyable job.
And my second question is that mainly one about morale. I mean, you've got a very dedicated immigration department of people. Do you struggle? Does the department struggle with morale, given that whatever they do is always criticised?
Look, you're right. Australia's immigration officials are a wonderfully professional bunch of people. Some of them are here today, led by the Secretary Martin Bowles. and they do a tough job. And as I say to them when I talk to them, they too are dealing with people's lives. They too are making important decisions. And they too sometimes can give people wonderful news that they have a chance of a life in Australia. Sometimes they give difficult news that, despite very legitimate ambitions on people to get a new life in Australia and really passionately held dreams of coming to have a life in Australia, we have the job of making sure our migration program is in Australia's best interest. And sometimes that means saying no and managing a huge network across the world of moving parts in terms of DIAC's posts around the world is a big challenge. But I think the people who work in immigration do so because they want to, they know the challenges, they know the complexities, and they love the job, just as I do.
I'll finish today with a follow-up from Morris's question. Given the opportunities and challenges of the post, is it good training perhaps for some future promotion?
Well, Lyndall, being Immigration Minister for 18 months is a post that I've really enjoyed, and I'll continue to enjoy for as long as the Prime Minister would like me to.
Thank you, Chris Bowen. As a thanks, a small token of our appreciation for you coming down here, membership of the Press Club, and a small gift, so you can come down and enjoy the facilities without necessarily having to speak for your supper.
And Lyndall, on our behalf, as this is your debut as compere, can I present you with a celebratory...
Thank you.
The federal government has announced an agreement to allow more than 1,700 foreign workers to be brought in to work on a large mining project in Western Australia. The agreement will allow the Royal Hill project in the Pilbara to sponsor overseas workers on 457 visas. It's the first enterprise migration agreement of its kind, but it's already drawn an angry response from union leaders who've accused the government of sheer lunacy.
It beggars belief that in this week of all weeks, this announcement is made today by Chris Bowen. On Monday, we had Qantas axe 500 manufacturing workers at their maintenance base in Tullamarine and 130 more at Avalon. On Wednesday, we had Norsk Hydro announce the closure of an aluminium smelter, the first time in Australian history that we've seen an aluminium smelter shut down. On Friday, we come to Canberra to meet with the Prime Minister and the Industry Minister and the CEOs of the major manufacturing companies to address the 130,000 jobs that have been lost out of manufacturing since 2008. And Chris Bowen is announcing that Gina Rinehart gets an early Christmas present with allowing a blanket approval to import 1,700 semi and low-skilled workers onto the Roy Hill program. I mean, I thought we were actually attacking these guys at the moment. Whose side are we on? This is a big win for Gina Rinehart, it's a big win for Clive Palmer, it's a big win for Twiggy Forrest, and it's a massive kick in the guts. A massive kick in the guts to those 130,000 workers in the manufacturing industry who have lost their jobs since 2008. And I just, for the life of me, can't understand why this decision was made in the current climate.
Paul Howes. Hello, you're watching ABC News 24. I'm Jane Hutchin. We're breaking away from the midday report to bring you a live news conference from the opposition immigration spokesman Scott Morrison. He's speaking in Sydney. We'll cross there right now.
And I did find it somewhat ironic and indeed hypocritical that the government today is lauding the success and the wealth of potential migrants they want to bring to Australia, but at the same time, with their class war budget rhetoric, they want to demonise and tax Australians for exactly the same thing, who already employ thousands of Australians and generate millions, if not billions, in tax revenue. And so I do find that a little passing strange, but nevertheless, the Coalition has always supported skilled migration and measures in the migration program that focus on skills and innovation. It was under a coalition government, under John Howard, that we increased the level of skilled migration from less than 30% under Labor of the permanent program to almost 70%. So we have always supported those types of measures and will obviously continue to do so. But under this government's migration policies, under this government's immigration program, the only innovation and entrepreneurship that has thrived so far has been that of the people smugglers. They're the ones who this government has rewarded with their soft immigration policies on our borders that have led to them reaping in hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of this government's soft border policies. And what we also see is today, with the New South Wales driven Task Force Polaris report, is that those failings on our border just aren't limited to immigration. This report is a damning indictment on the gaping holes that exist on our borders. And I note the junior minister today in making a number of announcements on this matter. But the thing that continues to trouble me as the member for Cook, in whose electorate the Sylvania Waters Post Office saw 220 Glock pistols allegedly brought into the country, that the questions still remain completely unanswered on that issue. And what I would like to see is that the government addresses more specifically that issue. I would also like to understand why today the government is not taking steps as a result of the Polaris report into their findings that were reported in the Herald today about alleged corruption within the Customs Service. These are very, very serious issues on our borders, and I think it's important that the government acts on those recommendations of that report, and particularly deals with the issues within their own border agency. I mean, some of the recommendations that the government has taken up and put in place today have been on the books for over a year. And the Task Force Polaris report has effectively forced this government's hand to admit that they have serious problems on our borders, that guns, that drugs are coming into the country, and some urgent action is needed. There's also a question here about what the former minister, Brendan O'Connor, was doing on his watch. It's taken the new junior minister to make a few announcements today, but I would like to know why Brendan O'Connor was not kept in that job, given the significant failings that have been identified today. In fact, he was promoted to cabinet. And so I think there are some questions here about Minister O'Connor's conduct while he was in the role. But what we know about border protection is it's just not a top order issue for this government. This government's agenda is driven by the Greens. And so as long as that is happening, we will continue to see border protection relegated to a minor issue in this government's agenda.
But you do support this measure that the government's talking about giving special provisions to businessmen who invest $5 million?
Well, the coalition's always supported measures that deal with skilled migration and a focus on skills. That's not just our position, it's our record. But I think the government does have to get its story straight if it wants to demonise Australians for success, but then seek to attract people to come to Australia because of that same success.
But just to be clear, on the enterprise migration agreements, I mean, the unions have concerns about them. You support them, though, do you?
Well, you're talking about two different things here. There's the announcements that the minister talked about today, and then there's the EMA for the Roy Hill mine. And look, we'll look at the details of that. The coalition hasn't been opposed to enterprise migration agreements. The real question is why this government only wants to put in place arrangements that deal with the top end of the resources sector, but leaves large parts of the resource sector untouched by those types of arrangements. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
The opposition immigration spokesman Scott Morrison speaking on various matters, including the special provision to businessmen prepared to invest $5 million or more in order to migrate to Australia.